Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Equityverse. Today, we're going to talk about several different companies in the electric vehicle sector or EV sector. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. In this video, I want to go through several different companies. So we're going to look at Tesla, Rivian, Lucid, maybe one or two others. And I just want to go through sort of what's going on, at least on the price chart, not only on their USD pairs, which seems like the obvious way that you would look at an EV company, but we're also going to look at some of them on their Tesla pairs. Now, that might sound surprising to value a company against another company, especially if you are new to this channel. But the premise behind a lot of investing is, at least that I talk about on this channel, is really maximizing your risk adjusted returns or focusing on certain types of companies at various phase of the market cycle or of the business cycle. So, for instance, one of the things that I have gone on and on and on about over the last 2 years, really ever since the Fed started to raise interest rates, was that the Bitcoin dominance in the crypto space, in the cryptoverse, the Bitcoin dominance was going to go up. And the reason for that was because the expectation is just simply that altcoins, which are higher risk, lower market cap, would bleed to the higher market cap, lower risk coins. So altcoins collectively would bleed to Bitcoin. Now, not all of them, but most of them. But what's fascinating is that this concept, while I know there's been a lot of pushback on the idea in the cryptoverse, this concept is not new. It has been going on for a long time in various sectors. And not only can you see it taking place in the crypto sector, where the Bitcoin dominance slowly climbs higher, but you can actually see it taking place in other sectors as well. And so I wanted to apply those same principles to the electric vehicle sector. Now, in crypto, your blue chip is Bitcoin. And you maybe want to include Ethereum into that as well. I could be on board with something like that. But in the electric vehicle space, in my opinion, right, there's only one blue chip, and it's Tesla. And one of the reasons that Tesla, I think, is the blue chip is because it's been around for the longest in terms of continuing to go to new heights and putting in new highs. You know, just sort of zooming out here, you can see that Tesla continues, from sort of one cycle to another, continues to ultimately push higher. Whereas a lot of the EV companies, we haven't necessarily seen that yet. For instance, if you were to look at Rivian, this is what the chart looks like, right? If you were to look at Lucid, this is what the chart looks like, right? It's basically only sort of just came about recently, and ever since then it's been going down. And then here's another one, NIO, right? I mean, it had a big move up in 2021, and then ever since then it's just been going downhill. But to me, what is more interesting than just simply looking at their USD valuations, which would make sense that they go down as we get further into a tightening cycle, because a lot of these brands, right, like if you think of like Lucid, a lot of them are these, sort of these luxury EV types that are not going to be as popular as, as the Fed tries to slow the economy, right? Those you would expect to start becoming more popular if they can survive the tightening cycle once looser monetary policy arrives. Now, when we look at a chart like this, right, when you look at a chart like this, like if you look at Lucid, for instance, you'll see that every step of the way, right, it just keeps on putting in lower highs. And every time, right, you maybe would have thought that was it, right, that was the moment. And so far, it just continues to be rejected basically by the bull market support band, right? It hasn't really had any type of durable move above it. The same thing goes with NIO. If you were to overlay the bull market support band, right, it hasn't really had a durable move above it. And the same thing with Rivian, although Rivian did had a little, that's the Rivian Tesla valuation. Here's the Rivian USD valuation. It did have a brief move back above it over here, but it has fallen once again and in fact has put in a new low. Now, what I would like to do is take the premise, the ideas that we've been studying in the Cryptoverse and apply it to the EV space and say, if Tesla is the blue chip, then what are alt EV company valuations against the blue chip EV company valuation? Seems like a pretty simple idea, right? So let's do the same thing, right? In the same way that we might look at say like the ETH Bitcoin valuation, right? Or the ADA Bitcoin or the Matic Bitcoin valuation. We can do the same thing with these companies, but instead of looking at their Bitcoin valuations, we're going to compare them against Tesla, which I think is sort of like the benchmark for the EV space. And we'll start here with the Rivian Tesla valuation. Now, what's fascinating to me is that this move that just occurred that took Rivian, the Rivian USD valuation, it took it down about 37% this week. If you look at the Rivian Tesla valuation, what's fascinating about this move is that it took it to the same spot that it was at in the summer of 2023. The same exact spot. So while I know not a lot of people would care about the Rivian Tesla valuation or whatever, the same premise could be applied to the EV space in the sense that if you want exposure to the EV space during a, late rate hike or late cycle where you've been going through a lot of rate hikes for a while, and quantitative tightening, you would want to stick with the blue chips because they give you exposure to the upside while they also minimize your downside risk, right? So like, for instance, Tesla, it hasn't really done anything in a long time, right? I mean, I was actually quite bearish on Tesla throughout this entire phase. My expectation for Tesla was that, back over here, was that it would likely go sub 100. It got pretty close, but it actually stayed above 100, only slightly. But it did stay above it. Now, since then, Tesla has basically just been chopping around, right, in the same range that it's been in for a long time. And, I find people that were very bullish over here on Tesla, declaring victory over here when it's like, yeah, like it still technically hasn't made the turn. I mean, I do think eventually it will. Don't get me wrong. I think eventually it will, but it is a long process. Now, there is a case to be made that, it's possible, it's certainly possible that Tesla, could hold these lows. It held sort of like a similar type of low in the last business cycle, right after, after sort of putting in this low here, it came back up, was putting in these lower highs, and then ultimately bottomed out around, that level right there, which is where it was previously testing, right? So in that sense, so you could make the case that this could be a significant level for Tesla. But the point is, and I've said this, the same thing with crypto, right? If you want exposure to the EV space, you're likely going to want to stick with, sort of the blue chip. And especially until we get to looser monetary policy. And what's fascinating is when you look at the Rivian Tesla valuation, it's back down to these lows. Now, that sort of raises the question, well, does that mean we could get a bounce, right? I mean, it's back down to the low. Does that mean that it could get a bounce? And certainly the answer is it could. I mean, the Rivian Tesla valuation dropped almost 35% this week. The week's not over. Well, by the time you're watching this video, the week will be over. But looking at it, say, on a daily time frame, what you'll notice, if you look at, say, like an RSI, Relative Strength Index of the Rivian Tesla valuation, I mean, you will see that it is all the way back down to the daily RSI that was actually at in June of 2023. It did go slightly lower though, but it did go down to those levels. So in that sense, right, there certainly could be a bounce or a technical bounce by the Rivian Tesla valuation. Do know that crashes occur at oversold conditions, so it's not impossible for it to just break the floor. There's a number of ways that it could bounce here, the Rivian Tesla valuation. It could be due to Rivian going up on its USD pair and Tesla not keeping pace with it, Or it could be Tesla breaking support here, right? It could be Tesla breaking support there and Rivian not dropping as much because, well, it's already dropped a lot, right? It already dropped 37%. So if Tesla were to break support, then it doesn't necessarily mean that the Rivian valuation against Tesla has to immediately go below its own support level. But with that idea in mind, right, with the idea that it is retesting the summer 2023 low, I think the important thing to consider is, well, what do the other companies look like against Tesla? Are they retesting the low? Are they above the low? Let's go take a look. So in this case, if you were to look at the Lucid Tesla valuation, you will find something very different. And the summer 2023 low by the Lucid Tesla valuation was taken out long ago, right? I mean, it was actually taken out back in September, October of 2023, and it hasn't really shown much durable strength since then. So imagine if over here you had assumed that the Lucid Tesla valuation was going to hold. Yes, it did bounce around it for a little bit, but eventually it did fade back down. The same thing could be said for NIO, right? The summer 2023 low for the NIO Tesla valuation, it did come back down to it in September. It got a bounce, but eventually it faded below it. And now it is still, it was putting in a new low only a few weeks ago. So we have to remember that when it gets down to these valuations, it can certainly bounce. But as the NIO Tesla valuation shows and the Lucid Tesla valuation shows, it still could continue to drop over a long enough period of time. So while you can get these bounces, and especially after 35% drops in a week, it doesn't necessarily mean that is the final floor, although it could be. One of the things I've said for alt Bitcoin valuations is that you would like to see the altcoin hold support on its Bitcoin pair in a Bitcoin USD downtrend. Now, what we've had here is we've had a Tesla USD downtrend, right? Tesla has been trending down on its USD pair. So the question is, can Rivian hold the Bitcoin valuation here, or does it not? Now, again, Rivian USD is at $10, and not too long ago, it was at $27, and then 24, and then 23. Back over here, it was at 40. Back over here, when Rivian launched, I was very clear in at least ITC Premium that this was way overvalued at the IPO. Now, what's crazy is since the IPO, the Rivian USD valuation is now down 94%. But I mean, again, if you're someone that looks at this and says, well, that means it has to go up. I mean, again, over here it was down 93%. It got a really big bounce. I mean, this is a huge bounce here. 150% rally, still put in a new low, right? It still put in a new low. And there's an interesting chart that actually someone posted on Twitter. I don't know if I have it up, but it was. Let me see if I can find it. It was essentially. Actually, I think I can get it over here. Give me a second. Okay, so it was this one right here. So this chart, I did not make this chart. The source is this person right here. Hopefully you can read that on Twitter. But this is a really interesting chart that shows the cash flow history of pure EV makers, right? So there are other companies that, of course, sell EVs, but we're looking at ones that really only make EVs. And if you look at the free cash flow history of these different these pure EV companies, what you will see is that Tesla is this blue line right here, right? For a long time, it was cash flow negative, right? I mean, it was burning through a lot of cash, but then in about the 8th to 9th year, it finally turned it around, and now it's, of course, cash flow positive, right? I mean, it finally turned it around in the 8th or 9th year. All these other pure EV makers have not turned the corner, right? They're still bleeding cash, right? I mean, like Lucid, Rivian, NIO, right? A lot of these are still losing money, and there's just no way to know which ones will ultimately survive. My guess is that when we look back at this video in 10 years, we will look at it and say, oh yeah, like no one knows what those companies are because some of them died, but maybe there's one or two that ultimately survive. It's really impossible to know which one, but it really goes to show you why the Rivian Tesla valuation has been bleeding. And it goes to show you why the Lucid Tesla valuation has been bleeding and the Neo Tesla valuation has been bleeding. So while Tesla USD hasn't really been doing anything impressive, and in fact, if you had bought it, any time of the last like 3 to 4 months or even longer, like 6 months ago, back in the summer of 2023, you're down, right? You've lost money on Tesla. The only way that you're up on Tesla is, if you bought it over here, right? Or right there. That's the only way that you're up. And so what's funny to me is like, as someone who hasn't really been that optimistic about Tesla in a while, especially I was quite bearish on it up here. I'm looking at it right here and saying it hasn't really gone anywhere, right? And I mean, if the drop over here had just done something like this, no one would have said anything. But because instead it went all the way down here and then bounced up here, now everyone who was bullish on Tesla over there is like, oh, look, we were right? Like it bounced off of these lows. But you have to be careful, right? I mean, again, the only way that you're up on Tesla is if you bought it, at least in recent time, right, is if you bought it over here. Of course, if you bought it over here, you've made a killing. And by the way, I have Tesla videos on my channel, and I was actually quite bullish on Tesla back over here, right? I mean, I was very optimistic about Tesla back then. I felt like it had a lot of upside potential. But ever since then, right, I mean, we've had this massive move. It's just taking a long consolidation, right? I mean, like it's going to take a long time for it to ultimately carve it out and to go on another parabolic route. I'm not saying that it can't ever do it. In fact, eventually it probably will. It's just that for the Tesla bulls over the last few years, right, like hasn't really accomplished anything. Now, if you want to cherry pick and say you went all in right there, then you've made some money and congratulations to you. But what I find is that most people are bullish on it on every single lower high, then get euphoric when it bounces back up. My perspective on Tesla, and I did a video on this a few weeks ago, is that if you want exposure to the EV space, Tesla is the blue chip, right? I mean, if there is a downturn in the economy, Tesla will likely be able to survive, right? So even if it does break the low, and if it goes back down to these lows here, or even puts in a new low, which is certainly a possibility, right? It's certainly a possibility. If that were to happen, I still think that Tesla would ultimately survive because the cash balance of it is much healthier than these other companies, right? It's doing much better. It's a lot more financially healthy than these other companies, right? They figured it out how to make it work. A lot of these other companies haven't yet figured that out. And the question ultimately is, can those companies figure it out before they go bankrupt, right? And so if you look at these charts, right, like the Lucid chart, every single time it tries to break through, it ultimately gets rejected. And I wonder if one of the reasons is because the market continuously is repricing when rate cuts actually come. 6 months ago, I think a lot of people thought we'd already have a rate cut by now, but we keep not having it. So I think, there's investors that come in here and say, all right, well, rate cuts will come eventually. We'll get back to looser rates and we'll go through another phase of expansion where we go back to looser monetary policy, we go back to QE and everything goes up, not just the high market cap stuff, like your NVIDIAs or your Bitcoin, that kind of stuff, the blue chips of each respective space. Instead, it just keeps on going lower. Right? It just continues to put in lower high after lower high after lower high. And it could simply be because rate cuts keep getting pushed further and further out. This is the issue in rate hiking cycles, is that bankruptcies go up, right? I mean, you can even look at them, right? Look at bankruptcies, right? Let's go take a look really quick. So here, let me just pull it up. So this is bankruptcies in the United States. Right? And of course, this is what happens when you go through a rate hiking cycle. If I overlay US interest rates, this is what happens, right? When you go through a lot of rate hikes like that, bankruptcies eventually start to go up, right? Interest rates went up, they held, and then bankruptcies started to go up. Now you can see that in these prior examples, right, rate cuts occurred, and even after rate cuts occurred, bankruptcies still went up in the short term. Right here, rate cuts occurred, bankruptcies were still going up. Bankruptcies are going up right now, so even if the Fed were to start to cut right now, it doesn't mean that bankruptcies are going to slow down. So the ultimate question when it comes to these EV companies is, will they survive long enough to last until looser monetary policy arrives, and thereby maybe demand goes up. Now, it ultimately depends on if the Fed pivots, either, do they induce a recession or do they pivot without inducing a recession? If they induce a recession, then bankruptcies can continue to go up even after they pivot. If they don't induce a recession, then perhaps that demand could come back. But again, I think that's been the issue for a lot of these smaller EV companies, is that their charts look way more abysmal than the Tesla USD valuation, right? Tesla USD, at least it hasn't taken out the January 2023 low. It doesn't mean that it can't, but it hasn't. Whereas Rivian took it out long ago, right? This is the January 2023 low right here at $16. Now we're at $10. For Lucid, the January 2023 low was all the way over here at $6. Now it's at $3, right? So it's 50% down. The NIO January 2023 low was all the way right here at around, $10 or $11. Now it's at $5, $5.50, so about a 50% drop. So Tesla is up about 100% from its January 2023 low, whereas Rivian, Lucid, and NIO are all down from their January 2023 low. And again, they're not cash flow positive, right? They're bleeding money, and they're hoping that the economy turns around and that demand for these EVs starts to go back up eventually. The real question is, can they survive long enough to turn the corner, right? And it all goes back to that chart I was showing you earlier, right? It goes back to this chart. Not only can they survive, but can they actually figure out a solution to turn this around just like Tesla did, right? You can see that Tesla turned it around at some point. For a long time, they were bleeding cash. I mean, they were not profitable. But eventually Tesla turned the corner, and then it became the behemoth that it is today. And so that's ultimately the question. And then sort of the counterpoint, or not the counterpoint, but the other thing to think about is that if Tesla were to break this low, which again, no guarantee that it does. And for full disclosure, I mean, I do have, I've been long-term bullish on Tesla forever. It's just that, when you have a move like this, you have to be aware that this kind of stuff can happen where it doesn't do a whole lot for a long time. The same thing happened with Tesla over here, right? It had a massive move up in 2013, and then it didn't do anything for 6 or 7 years, right? Now it basically hasn't really done a whole lot in 3 years or so, 2 to 3 years. So it's not, to talk about the potential downside and all that sort of stuff back over here, it's not like I'm anti-Tesla. It's just, guys, we had a massive rally by Tesla to the tune of 3,200% rally. It's okay for this kind of stuff to happen. So the problem for the EV companies is that if Tesla were to break support, then they also likely go down on their USD pairs, right? So Rivian could go down further on its USD pair if Tesla were to break support. If Tesla were to break support, you might see the Rivian Tesla valuation get a bounce because perhaps Tesla would drop more than Rivian, but Rivian would still be going down against the US dollar, more than likely. And I think that's kind of what it comes back to is, yes, you can get technical bounces at these support levels, just like we saw with Lucid Tesla, right? It got a little bit of a bounce right there. Not a lot, but a little bit of one. And even NIO Tesla had some bounces in here, right? Off that low, it bounced up about 14% or so off that low. So it's important to remember that can happen. If we were to overlay Tesla USD onto that chart, when NIO Tesla got a bounce, you can see that it bounced precisely at the time that Tesla USD sold off, right? That was when it bounced. And that's what I'm going back to is if Tesla were to break that low, then Rivian, Lucid, and NIO all likely take a hit. Even if their Tesla valuations go up in the short term, it doesn't matter, right? I mean, because that's the whole idea, is that they don't go down monotonically, but they still generally bleed until you get back to looser monetary policy. And not only until you get back to looser monetary policy, but also until they turn the corner and they figure out a way to make their company profitable or cash flow positive. There's a lot of companies that just bleed and then they just go bankrupt, right? I mean, like, look at Bed Bath & Beyond. It's a great example of a company. And again, this chart is was suspended in May of 2023 because they went bankrupt. And I mean, all sorts of reasons why you could have thought they were going to survive. I mean, 600% rally right there, 350% rally right there. It still ultimately went bankrupt and went to zero. Okay, so that's the issue with these business cycles, is that the Fed is purposely trying to slow the economy. And an artifact of slowing the economy is that the companies that are zombie companies, that are not profitable, that were only living and only existing via low interest rates, those companies, a lot of them go bankrupt. Think about what happened in crypto. Think about which ones went bankrupt first, right? Or which ones went down, like FTX, BlockFi, Celsius, Voyager, right? The frothiest of things, they go away first. Then as time goes on, you get further into the cycle. You got other companies going down, like Bed Bath & Beyond went bankrupt in 2023. And as we showed earlier, right, bankruptcies are still going up. And so I'm pretty confident that Tesla is not going bankrupt, at least not anytime soon. At least I hope not. But can any of us really confidently say that about any of the other pure EV companies, right? And I don't think we can. I think what we could say is that if any of them reach a point where they're holding their Tesla valuations and they're not going lower on their Tesla valuations, then that might imply there is some potential upside there. But theoretically, you would need to see that, and that has not been proven yet. Given enough time, all three of these EV companies that we're looking at against Tesla, all three of them just continue to go lower on their Tesla valuations. And again, my expectation is that that will continue until you go back to looser monetary policy. And so you could think of it like the Tesla dominance goes up. But does it go up in a straight line? No, but it still goes up, right? It's still going up. And my guess is that it'll continue going up until what? You said it, we get back to looser monetary policy. So the same principles that we look at in the cryptoverse, right, I think can be applied to other sectors, right? The EV sector is a great example, and you can see the same principles playing out. So for instance, like if you wanted to, sort of invest in the EV sector, not only, all these other companies have just been bleeding to Tesla. Not that Tesla has been doing anything impressive, but the point is that Tesla gives you exposure to the EV space while also theoretically minimizing your downside risk. And if it were to crater, if it were to break the low, what do you think happens to Rivian, Lucid, and Neo? And if Tesla bounces here, then it would still likely outperform these other companies. Now, a lot of times when you get these sorts of candles right here, there can be bounces, right? I'm not trying to say that there won't be. It's just that you have to be careful because a lot of these companies, and I've been watching them like a hawk for a long time because I'm actually interested to see which ones survive. And you know what? I'll be honest, if any of these companies can survive the rate hiking cycle and they start to turn the corner, right? They start to turn the corner and start to figure out a way to become, to make a profit, then I might get interested in them. To invest in any of them now could be profitable, but it's also very risky because we just don't know which ones will survive. We don't know which ones will go bankrupt and which ones won't. Because Tesla has a healthy cash balance, it's much more likely they'll survive. We'll see. We'll see if the others survive or not. But I just wanted to go through the same thought process that we've applied to the cryptoverse and see it applied in another sector, right? And see that same trend play out. See, and by the way, we talked about this on ITC Premium months ago, right? Months ago, the Rivian Bitcoin value, the Rivian Tesla valuation, the Lucid Tesla valuation, right? And how they've just been bleeding for a long time, and there hasn't there hasn't been a clear indication that they're turning around. But I will keep an eye on the Rivian Tesla valuation. We'll see if it holds. I don't know. I have no problem with it holding. I've seen the trucks. I mean, I honestly I think competition would be a good thing. And I think it would encourage people to, these companies to innovate even more. I don't want to see all these companies die off. But I think as an investor, if you're wondering, whether to take positions in certain companies over others, look at their valuation against that company, right? Look at how they're performing. And what's fascinating is despite the fact that Tesla is down over 50% from its peak, the NIO Tesla valuation from its peak is down 95%. And from the peak that we had in 2020, right, from the peak that NIO had against Tesla in 2020, it's down 93%. So you have an asset that's down over 90% against an asset that went down 50%. That's how badly NIO has gone down. Same thing for Rivian and Lucid, right? Rivian has gone down now against Tesla from the peak in 2021. It's gone down almost 90%. Against Tesla, which also went down 50%. It shows you just how much money people have lost with those companies. And again, as an investor who's relatively risk averse, it always makes sense to be more blue chip focused, especially when you're in an environment like we're in now. But eventually that should turn around, right? Eventually, whatever companies survive, whatever pure EV companies survive, if any, besides Tesla, right? Whichever ones survive and can figure out a way to be profitable, those are the ones that can give oversized returns in a future business cycle because they survived the downturn, they survived the rate hiking cycle, they survived tighter monetary policy, and when you hit rock bottom, right? I mean, theoretically, there's only one way to go, assuming you can find a way to be profitable. If they can't find a way to be profitable, then the ultimate outcome is likely that they go bankrupt eventually, especially during a period of higher interest rates. I think a lot of these companies have been, they've been so accustomed to low interest rates that now that they're having to deal with high interest rates, it's not so easy when cash is more expensive, right? When the cost of capital has gone up, it's not as easy to keep these companies alive. And so you have to basically just wait and see which ones survive. So if you're a super high risk person and you're putting money into these pure EV companies, especially besides Tesla, the main risk that you face is just the company going bankrupt. Because if the company doesn't go bankrupt and can survive, then it could work out well for you. But it's a big risk to take, right? Big risk could theoretically turn into a big reward. It also could just go to zero. You know how like in crypto, when people say, well, if you buy altcoins, you have to be okay with it going to zero, right? It's the same thing with this, right? I mean, you have to be okay with it. And, for me, as I've said, at this phase in the cycle, the blue chips tend to outperform until you get closer to that looser monetary policy. And remember, again, if you were to look at when these pure EV companies could turn it around against Tesla, which again is the blue chip, I would just remind you to go look at something like the alt Bitcoin chart and say, when did they turn it around, right? When did they finally turn it around last cycle? And it was right here, right? It was right there in September of 2019, which by the way, is precisely when the Fed started to increase the size of their balance sheet, right? Look at that. That was where alt Bitcoin pairs bottomed last cycle, with the exception of the Bitcoin parabolic rally that occurred later. But you can see it pretty clear that alt Bitcoin pairs bottomed when the Fed pivoted to QE. Same thing, right? Alt Bitcoin pairs, my expectation, kind of like how alt EV companies are bleeding back to Tesla and they're now testing the June 2023 low, or some of them are already below the June 2023 low. This is the June 2023 low for alt Bitcoin pairs. My guess is only a matter of time before they come back down to that level. And some of them have already broken that June 2023 low. The weaker altcoins have already broken below it. The stronger altcoins are still holding above it. Collectively, they're still holding above it. But just like the EV space shows us, the most likely outcome is for those altcoins to ultimately bleed to the blue chip, which is Bitcoin. So if you're curious when Rivian, the Rivian Tesla valuation might turn around, or the Neo Tesla valuation might turn around, or the Lucid Tesla valuation might turn around, I think you would have to wait for that at the very least. That doesn't mean they will turn around. And in fact, if they don't come up with a good product that is profitable, they will never turn around. But I think at the very least, you would want to see that for them to have a realistic chance of durably turning around. And if you get that, if you get a pivot by the Fed, you go back to QE, and any of these companies look like they could be on a path to profitability, that's where the oversized gains can come from. Until then, Tesla dominance will likely just continue to increase on and off until looser monetary policy arrives, which still theoretically should be sometime this year. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up. I want to say one more thing. I just remembered, if you go over to the website, you can also sort by these different equities, right? Like you can look at Lucid, you can look at all these different valuations for it. You can even look at like the running 1-year ROI. Look at this. It's basically just been below 1 since May of 2022, right? People that are throwing money into it have lost money. But I mean, hopefully, I honestly hope that it turns around. I sat in a Lucid not too long ago, and I thought it was a nice car, right? But you still have to be profitable, right? You still have to be a profitable company to survive. You can't just have a nice product. You have to be able to produce that product and make a return on it. And so that's something that you should consider. And I imagine we have the same thing for, like you can click on Rivian and go look at various charts and see like, what are company liabilities, and just kind of play it like that. See what these companies are doing, see when they could theoretically turn it around at the earliest, and figure out if it makes sense for you. I've tried to explain my rationale behind not only Bitcoin dominance, but also the same idea, Tesla dominance. It doesn't mean that the blue chips can't drop. I mean, we've seen Tesla drop a lot, right? I mean, it just means that if they do drop, they probably won't drop as much as the alt coins, or in this case, the alt companies, right? The alt EV companies. They just won't drop as much. And at the end of the day, in 10 years, there's a good chance Tesla will still be here. It's profitable. It has, positive cash flow. It has a healthy balance sheet. In 10 years, a lot of those pure EV companies might be gone. Maybe a few of them survive, and I hope they do. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.